You won't believe what happened after Eleanor Reynolds opened a dusty old library book and discovered a name from her forgotten past. What followed was a trail of hidden notes, childhood memories, and a reunion 2 decades in the making. What would you do if the friend you lost long ago left behind a story, just waiting for you to find it? Welcome to our YouTube channel. Before diving into this extraordinary tale, take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe. Your support helps us bring you more touching stories like this one. Now, let's uncover the pages of a friendship lost and found again. It was the kind of afternoon that begged for quiet, rain whispering against the windows, gray clouds muffling the world, and Eleanor Reynolds ducking into the old stone library on Clement Street like it was a sanctuary from her life. The building itself smelled of warm paper and memories, the kind of place that still used wooden card catalogs and hushed glances to communicate. Eleanor hadn't been inside this library since she was a teenager, and yet something about the way the rain tapped insistently at the glass made her veer from her usual path home and step inside, heart oddly light. She passed rows of fiction and non-fiction, her fingers brushing against spines like they were sleeping animals, until she arrived at the children's section, not intentionally, but instinctively. A small table with a display of worn favorites sat near the back, and on top of it was a book with a cover she hadn't seen in almost 20 years, The Whispering Tree. Her breath caught. That book had been their book, hers and Jamie's. She picked it up reverently, fingertips tingling, and opened the inside cover, more out of habit than hope. And there it was, a name, scribbled in childish handwriting that slanted slightly to the right, Jamie W. Her pulse stumbled. That messy W had been the signature of her childhood best friend, Jamie Wilder, the boy who once swore they'd write stories together forever, then vanished without a goodbye at the end of that summer long ago. Eleanor stood frozen, one hand on the page and the other on her heart, afraid that blinking would erase it. The memory swept in like a warm tide, hot July afternoons, popsicle-stained hands, and the way Jamie had read aloud from the Whispering Tree as if casting spells. He had been fearless and full of dreams, the only person who truly saw her when she was an awkward, quiet kid with too many notebooks and not enough friends. She sat down right there on the child-sized bench and opened the book fully, flipping through the pages like they might hold something more. A folded scrap of paper slipped out and fluttered to the floor. Hands trembling, Eleanor picked it up. It was blank, but aged and creased, clearly forgotten between pages for years. Her eyes burned. How had this book ended up here again? Was it a donation? Had Jamie returned it recently? Or had it been here all along, waiting for her to return? The coincidence felt too pointed, too meaningful. She turned the pages slowly, reading the lines they used to giggle over, the story of a girl and a boy who climbed into a magical tree to escape the world, finding kingdoms and courage they never knew they had. Eleanor found herself mouthing the lines as she read, her voice low and full of memory. And suddenly she realized how long it had been since anyone had called her Elle. Jamie was the only one who ever had. She tucked the note back inside the book, closed the cover, and held it to her chest, heart hammering with questions. Could Jamie still be in the city? Had he left this book here for her to find? Was it fate, or just forgotten coincidence? She checked the borrowing slip in the back, stamp dates, most unreadable, but one faint name caught her eye, J. Wilder, 2009. Her breath hitched. It had been the summer he disappeared. The last summer she felt seen. Eleanor checked the clock. She hadn't meant to stay long, but time had melted away. She borrowed the book, careful not to bend its cover, and stepped back out into the rainy world with the strangest sensation in her chest, like something old and aching had stirred awake. She walked home in silence, the book tucked under her coat like it might disappear if it got wet. That night, she placed it on her nightstand and stared at it while brushing her teeth, the way someone might eye a portal that had unexpectedly opened. She barely slept. By morning, she had pulled out an old box of childhood things from the back of her closet, stickers, letters, pictures, and began digging through the past. Something had shifted. A door had creaked open. Jamie Wilder had once promised her that real friends never leave for good, they just go where the story takes them. And now, Eleanor had every intention of finding out where their story had gone. Eleanor sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, surrounded by the detritus of a younger life, stickers curling at the edges, ticket stubs from long-forgotten events, a friendship bracelet half-finished, and a stack of dusty journals with glittering covers. She hadn't opened these boxes since her early 20s, unsure whether revisiting those memories would bring comfort or ache, but now, with the whispering tree resting nearby like a compass, she dove in without hesitation. The first journal she opened was from the summer of 2009, its pages smudged with faint pencil lines and the looped handwriting of an 11-year-old girl. Today Jamie and I built a pirate ship out of sofa cushions. One entry read, "We named it the SS Never Grow, and he made me captain." Eleanor smiled at the memory, the details unspooling like a long-lost film reel. Jamie with his chipped tooth and wild curls, always daring her to climb higher, imagine bigger, and dream louder. They'd met the summer her parents were separating, and while the world around her cracked quietly, Jamie had arrived like a storm of color in her gray sky. For 3 perfect months, he had been her anchor, her escape, her co-author in adventures that turned their small town into a canvas of wonder. They built forts under staircases, created treasure maps, and scribbled stories about forest kingdoms and talking foxes. But what she remembered most was the laughter, bright, unfiltered, and full of something she hadn't felt in years, possibility. Her hand lingered over a drawing they'd made together. 2 stick figures holding hands under a tree with stars above them, and the caption, "Best friends forever, even if the tree falls down." Her throat tightened. She flipped to the last entry of that summer. Jamie didn't come today. His house was empty. Mom said they moved away. No goodbye. I don't know why, but it hurts so much I feel like I'm cracking open. The writing stopped abruptly. Eleanor remembered crying into her pillow that night, certain she'd done something wrong. For years, she convinced herself it was just childhood, it didn't mean anything. But now, sitting here, she knew better. Jamie hadn't been just a childhood friend, he'd been a lifeline. And that sudden absence had left a hollow space she'd never truly filled. She opened more journals, flipping past the years that followed, watching herself grow quieter on the page. By high school, the whimsical entries had become sparse, replaced by musings on loneliness, the occasional crush, and dreams she no longer chased. "I don't really write stories anymore," one page confessed. "It feels silly. I think Jamie took that part of me with him." Eleanor exhaled shakily. She hadn't realized how deeply she'd buried that truth. All her creative energy, her spark, her desire to write, it had slowly faded after he left. She reached for a photo album, fingers tracing a sun-bleached picture of 2 kids with ice cream-smeared faces, beaming at the camera. Jamie's arm was around her shoulder, and she remembered the photographer was his mom, always laughing, always humming. But they were gone now, a ghost family that had vanished overnight. Her mind looped the question again, why would someone disappear like that? And why had his name resurfaced now, like a flare sent up through time? Determined, she pulled out her middle school yearbooks, scanning every face. Jamie wasn't in them, he'd left too early. But her eyes caught a note scribbled in silver ink at the back of one. "If you ever miss me, look in the stories. I'm always there. J." She didn't remember seeing it before. Had she skipped that page all these years? A chill ran down her spine, not of fear, but of fate. Something had nudged this moment into being. She gathered her journals, the photo, and the book, placing them gently into a canvas bag. Tomorrow, she would return to the library, not just to read, but to search. If Jamie had written himself into the pages, she would find him again. For the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt like the story wasn't finished. It had just been waiting for its next chapter. The next morning, Eleanor returned to the Clement Street Library just as the doors creaked open, the early light slanting through tall windows in dusty gold beams. Mr. Ellsworth, the elderly librarian with a gentle voice and a bow tie that never matched his shirt, looked up from his desk and offered her a nod. "Back so soon?" he asked with a knowing smile. "Some books," Eleanor replied. "Don't let go." He chuckled but said nothing more as she wandered past the front desk into the quiet hush of shelves. She headed straight for the children's section, heart quickening as she retrieved the whispering tree from her bag and placed it back on the little table where it first called to her. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Perhaps a sign, a pattern, anything that could explain Jamie's name in the book after all these years. She examined the checkout slip again, studying the names and dates, most of which were either faded or scribbled. But then she noticed something. Jamie W.'s name had appeared not just once in 2009, but again in 2014, and once more in 2018, always borrowing the same book. A strange pattern. She flipped through the pages again, more slowly this time, and halfway through, she found a torn corner of paper wedged deep in the gutter between two chapters. Carefully pulling it out, she unfolded a miniature triangle of lined paper, aged and yellowed. It was a quote in block letters. "The stars we drew are still up there. J.W." Her breath caught. It was a phrase Jamie had said during one of their midnight backyard sleepovers, when they lay under the summer sky trying to name constellations after their made-up story characters. She closed her eyes for a moment, the memory so vivid it felt like he was beside her again. Encouraged, Eleanor searched other books nearby, ones she and Jamie had read as children, and checked their spines, looking for clues. Inside a worn copy of The Night Fox, she found a dried purple flower pressed between pages. Tucked beneath it was a note in tiny cursive, "For Elle. If you ever find this, I didn't forget." Her throat tightened. These were not coincidences. Someone had been leaving pieces behind, like whispers meant only for her to hear. But who? Jamie? A friend of his? Or was it Jamie himself, returning to this library in intervals, like a lighthouse keeper tending a flame no one else could see? She brought the discoveries to Mr. Ellsworth, who peered at the slips through thick glasses and nodded slowly. "Some patrons leave behind secrets," he said softly. "Sometimes books are better at keeping them than people." Eleanor smiled sadly. "Have you seen anyone named Jamie Wilder here?" He tapped his chin thoughtfully. "Not in recent years. But a young man used to come by every few years like clockwork. Didn't say much, but he always borrowed the Whispering Tree. I remember because he always checked out exactly one book." Her fingers curled around the note. "Do you remember when he last came?" Mr. Ellsworth walked to a back desk and returned with an old visitor log. She flipped through until she found it, Jamie W., signed in August 2023, almost exactly a year ago. Her heart raced. That meant he'd been here recently. Possibly still nearby. Mr. Ellsworth tilted his head. "He once asked about you, I think. Years ago. Said you used to come here together as kids." Eleanor could barely breathe. "Did he leave a contact?" The librarian shook his head. "Just a name. But maybe he's still watching the books." That evening, Eleanor returned with sticky notes and a pen. She wrote her own message, "If you're still reading, Jamie. I remember. I never stopped." She tucked it into the Whispering Tree, then placed the book neatly back in its spot, almost reverently. Every day after, she returned, checking to see if it was gone, or if her note had been answered. For weeks, it remained untouched. But then, one rainy Thursday, she found something new in its place, a folded paper with just 3 words written in all caps, "I remember too." Eleanor stared at the paper in her hand for what felt like an eternity, her heart beating in staccato. The words, "I remember too," burned into her mind like embers catching dry leaves. She turned it over, half hoping for a return address, initials, anything, but the back was blank. Still, it was the first concrete sign that Jamie was out there, that her search wasn't just a journey through memory but one tethered to something real. That night, she spread everything she had on her living room floor like a map, the notes, the book, her journals, the photograph of them laughing, and the visitor log entry from Mr. Ellsworth. Piecing them together, she realized something curious. Jamie's book checkouts had always occurred in August. He had returned to the Whispering Tree in 2009, 2014, 2018, and most recently 2023. That was a 5-year pattern, almost like a ritual. What if he always returned on the same date? Was August significant? She flipped back through her journals. August 9th had been the day they buried a time capsule in her backyard. August 9th had been the day he'd vanished. Her eyes widened. She looked at the calendar. August 4th was tomorrow. And the last entry in the visitor log? August 8th, 2023. That meant, if he returned again, it would be this week. But where would he come from? Would he appear at the library again? Or was it just a coincidence? Eleanor couldn't take the uncertainty any longer. The next day, she asked Mr. Ellsworth if any other libraries nearby had copies of The Whispering Tree, hoping she could track Jamie through another location. "Well," he said, tapping on his ancient keyboard, "there's a sister branch in Maribel. Small coastal town, 30 minutes south." Eleanor had never heard of it, but something about the name tugged at her. She packed her things that same afternoon, booking a weekend stay in Maribel and taking with her the book, the notes, and a heart full of cautious hope. The town, when she arrived, looked like it had been plucked from a storybook. Narrow cobbled streets, pastel-painted shops, a clock tower in the square, and most importantly, a quiet little library with ivy crawling up its brick facade. The air smelled of sea salt and wildflowers. She stepped inside, heart pounding. A younger librarian greeted her, and Eleanor asked if they had a copy of The Whispering Tree. The librarian nodded and led her to a back shelf where the book sat, nearly identical to her own copy. Hands trembling, she flipped it open. Inside the cover was another note: "Some trees don't forget their roots." Eleanor's knees nearly buckled. This was it. He had been here. Recently. She turned to the librarian again, asking carefully, "Do you know anyone named Jamie Wilder?" The woman blinked. "Actually, yes. He used to live here. Still visits sometimes. He leads a local writing group on Wednesdays at the book cafe down the street." Eleanor barely whispered her thanks before rushing into the fading sunlight, the name of the cafe, the ink and bean, bouncing in her head like a bell. She stood outside the door for a full minute before gathering the courage to enter. The smell of espresso and old paper hit her instantly. She scanned the room: students, readers, a barista steaming milk. No Jamie. But then she noticed a corkboard by the window, pinned with local announcements. There it was: Creative Writing Circle, Wednesdays at 6 p.m., led by J.W. The flyer looked newly printed. Her hands were shaking again. She returned the next day, sitting quietly in a corner booth with a notebook and tea she never drank, eyes on the door every time it opened. But Jamie didn't come. A barista with warm eyes eventually approached and asked, "Waiting for someone?" Eleanor hesitated. "Sort of." She explained in pieces: childhood friends, a lost connection, a book, a name. The barista listened kindly, then said, "Jamie hasn't been in for a few weeks. But he left this behind last time. Said someone might come looking." She handed Eleanor a folded piece of paper. Inside was a hand-drawn map of Maribel with a house marked in red ink and the words, "If you're still looking, come find me." Eleanor clutched the paper like it was a key, tears stinging her eyes. She didn't know what she would find at the end of the street marked in red, but she knew she had to go. Not tomorrow. Not later. Because sometimes the pages of a story don't wait, they call. The red-marked house on Jamie's hand-drawn map was nestled at the far edge of Maribel, past rows of painted cottages and gardens fragrant with jasmine and rosemary, just before the coastal cliffs began to slope steeply toward the sea. Eleanor followed the winding road with cautious hope curling around her ribs, the kind of fragile hope that could collapse under the weight of reality. Her hands gripped the paper so tightly the edges had frayed, and her heart thudded with the cadence of a story nearing its climax. As she reached the address, a small, slate-roofed home with ivy growing wild across the porch, she hesitated. The curtains were drawn. No sign of movement. But the mailbox had Jamie's initials, J.W., in carved brass. She knocked once, twice, her knuckles catching on the wood. No answer. After a minute, she placed the note she had written the night before, folded into thirds, marked only with her initials, E.R., at the base of the door. As she turned to leave, a voice behind her made her stop cold. "Looking for Jamie?" Eleanor spun, her breath catching, only to find a woman around her age, leaning on a bicycle, her face partially hidden by the late afternoon light. "Yes," Eleanor said. I'm an old friend." The woman got off her bike slowly. "You just missed him. He left 2 days ago. Said he needed to clear his head." Eleanor's stomach twisted. "Do you know when he's coming back?" The woman shrugged. "Hard to say. He's like that. Always leaving, always chasing something just out of reach." Eleanor tried to mask her disappointment. "Do you know where he went?" The woman studied her for a moment before responding. "I think he left something for you. Inside." She led Eleanor through the unlocked door into a home filled with books, sketches, and the faint smell of sandalwood. On a desk by the window sat a stack of papers, stories, by the look of it, and on top, a small, handcrafted zine titled Rooted Wings. The cover was drawn in pencil, 2 figures beneath a tree whose branches stretched into the clouds. The woman handed it to Eleanor and said, "He made those every few years. Only shared them with people he trusted. That one he made last summer." Eleanor sat down and opened it with reverence. Inside were short stories, illustrations, poems, but what stilled her was the final page, where Jamie had written, "To the girl who made the world magical again. If you ever find this, I'm still writing our story." Tears blurred the ink. It wasn't a reunion, not yet. But it was proof that he remembered, that he still carried her in the quiet spaces of his life. "He used to talk about you," the woman said softly. "Said you were the first person who ever really listened to him. The first person who believed in his stories." Eleanor pressed the zine to her chest. "He was that for me, too." The woman smiled. "There's a writing group. Wednesdays. He ran it here at the Ink and Bean before he left. You could join. Maybe he'll come back." That night, Eleanor stayed in Maribel. She walked by the shore, the salty wind tangling her hair, and stared up at the stars they used to name. It wasn't the ending she had hoped for, but it was something rare and beautiful, a breadcrumb left with intention. Back in her room, she took out her journal, the one she hadn't touched in years, and began to write, not about longing, but about roots that stretch unseen between people, and about the courage it takes to keep walking toward a story unfinished. Because now she knew, Jamie hadn't forgotten. He had simply been waiting for the right page to turn. Eleanor awoke the next morning to a soft drizzle tapping the windows of her Maribel guesthouse, the kind of gentle rain that muffled the world and seemed to suspend time itself. The zine Jamie had created, Rooted Wings, rested on the nightstand beside her like a whispered promise, and its final words echoed in her head, "I'm still writing our story." She sat up slowly, the blankets pooled around her waist, and reached for her journal, the leather-bound one she'd resurrected just days ago. For a long time, she simply stared at the blank page, the pen in her hand hovering like a question. Then, without thinking, she began to write. The words came in a slow, aching rush, memories, apologies, fragments of dreams and fears she hadn't realized were still lodged in her chest. "Dear Jamie," she began, "I don't know where you are right now. But if this finds you, if something in the world pulls this page toward your hands, know that I've been carrying our story with me all this time." She wrote of the whispering tree, the secret codes and margins, the way he had unknowingly kept her belief in magic alive through every faded memory. She wrote about the hollow space his disappearance had left, and the way it shaped her life in quiet, invisible ways. You once said stories are how we keep people alive. I think I've been keeping you alive in every word I never wrote. The letter was raw, unfiltered, and by the time she reached the final paragraph, Eleanor's hand was trembling. If we never meet again, I hope you know, you mattered. You mattered more than anyone else ever did. She folded the letter carefully, slid it into an envelope, and addressed it to nowhere. She didn't even know if he had a mailbox. For the rest of the day, she carried it in her bag like an unopened chapter. That afternoon, she returned to the Ink and Bean Cafe, joining the small writing group Jamie had once led. The barista, now familiar with her presence, simply handed her a cup of chai and a nod of welcome. Around the table sat a mix of locals, an elderly man with a stack of haikus, a teenager scribbling lyrics, a mother drafting a children's story. Eleanor didn't speak much, just listened, observed, soaked in the spirit of creativity Jamie had left behind. And then, when the session ended and most chairs were emptying, she saw it, the whispering tree, her copy, the one with Jamie's original note, sitting atop a shelf by the door. She rushed over, heart racing. Inside, where she had left her sticky note weeks ago, was a new margin message, scrawled in familiar looping handwriting, "If you ever write me back, I'll be reading." Her breath hitched, fingers tightening around the cover. It was him. Somehow, he had returned. Recently. Quietly. She checked the back page and found a newer note folded within, "Next Wednesday. Reading room. 5 p.m. It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. Eleanor clutched the book to her chest, joy and fear crashing together like waves against the cliffs. She returned to her guest house that night and unfolded the letter. Her fingers hovered over the envelope. Should she give it to him? Was it too much? Too soon? In the end, she slipped it beneath the pillow and left it unopened. She would wait. Wait for Wednesday. Wait for him. Because some letters were meant to be read aloud, face to face, eye to eye, with no pages between them. And maybe, just maybe, the story that had started in the margins was finally ready to return to the center of the page. The reading room at the Clement Street Library hadn't changed since Eleanor was a child. Its tall windows still bathed the room in soft amber light by late afternoon, its green-shaded lamps still hummed with quiet electricity, and its long oak table bore the gentle scars of years of elbows, pens, and dreams. She arrived early, book in hand, the same copy of The Whispering Tree that had first stirred this entire story back to life. Her palms were slightly damp as she laid it on the table and took the seat farthest from the door, heart thudding like a metronome marking each moment until 5 o'clock. The room was nearly empty, save for a sleeping student in the corner and the quiet rustle of pages being turned. She checked the time. 4:55. 5 minutes. 5 lifetimes. Her eyes flicked to the door every few seconds, her thoughts spiraling with what-ifs and maybes. What if he didn't come? What if it wasn't him at all? What if she had only been chasing ghosts? And then, at exactly 5 p.m., the door creaked open. A figure stepped through, tall, broad-shouldered, with the same untamed curls she remembered, now peppered with hints of gray. He looked older, wiser, weathered by time, but when his eyes scanned the room and landed on her, the years seemed to fall away in a single breath. "Elle," he said, voice low and reverent, as if speaking a word he hadn't dared say out loud in years. "Jamie," she replied, rising slowly, her legs unsure beneath her. For a moment, they simply stood across from one another, a thousand unspoken things trembling in the space between them. Then he crossed the room in 4 strides and embraced her, not the careful hug of strangers reunited, but the kind that said, "I never stopped looking for you either." Eleanor closed her eyes, the scent of him triggering summers long past, the feel of his arms grounding her in a reality she hadn't dared to believe. When they pulled apart, both were smiling, eyes glassy. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she whispered. "I wasn't sure you'd find me," he said. They sat down together, side by side at the long oak table, the book resting between them like a shared heartbeat. Jamie reached out and flipped it open to the inside cover. "This thing really kept us tethered, huh?" Eleanor nodded. "Like roots in the dark." He pulled something from his coat pocket, a folded piece of paper. She recognized it instantly. Her letter. "You left this under the pillow," he said gently. "I came back to the guest house the next morning. I was hoping you might still be there." "Did you read it?" she asked. "Not yet," he admitted. "I wanted you to read it to me. If you still want to." Eleanor hesitated only a moment, then opened the letter, her voice quiet but steady as she read each word she'd written in that soft-lit room in Maribel. Jamie listened without interrupting, eyes never leaving her face, like he was hearing more than just her words. When she finished, there was a silence that wasn't empty, but full. Full of healing. Full of truth. Full of everything that had waited, patiently, to be felt. "I wrote you letters too," Jamie said softly. "I just never sent them. I left them in books, in margins, hoping someday you'd read between the lines." Eleanor laughed through her tears. "We really are ridiculous romantics." "Writers," he corrected with a smile. "Always were." And with that, they opened a fresh notebook between them. Together, they began sketching ideas for a story about two childhood friends who got separated by time but found their way back through a library book and the memories it held. The first line read, "Some stories never really end, they just take a while to find their next chapter." And in the reading room, beneath the warm light of the library they once roamed as children, they began to write it, together. The library became their sanctuary in the weeks that followed, the reading room by day, and Jamie's cottage in Maribel by night, where cups of tea cooled beside scattered notebooks and old songs hummed low in the background. They worked on their book with enthusiasm, layering their childhood memories into whimsical tales of magical trees, talking foxes, and secret constellations. But beneath the surface of laughter and creative energy lay something unspoken, a subtle tension that surfaced in the quiet pauses between sentences, in the way Jamie sometimes hesitated before writing certain scenes, or the way Eleanor's eyes lingered on old journal entries she didn't mention aloud. One evening, after a particularly long writing session, they sat on the porch watching the sea dissolve into dusk. Eleanor broke the silence first. "Why didn't you say goodbye?" she asked, the question gentle but firm, like a door being opened slowly. Jamie took a long breath. "We left in the middle of the night. My dad lost his job. There were things going on. And I was 11, I didn't know how to make sense of it." She nodded, but her voice trembled. "I thought I did something wrong. You were just gone." He turned to face her fully, regret swimming in his eyes. "You didn't do anything wrong. I thought about writing. I tried. But I didn't think you'd even remember me after a while." Eleanor gave a half-laugh, half-sob. "You were the only person who made me feel real back then." Of course I remembered. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was weighty, raw, filled with the ache of years unsaid. Jamie reached into his bag and pulled out a bundle of folded pages. "These are the letters I wrote you," he said. "Every August. I never mailed them. I left them in books, hid them in zines, in margins. I think I was waiting for you to find me." Eleanor unfolded one and began to read, her eyes scanning words written in Jamie's unmistakable looping scrawl, each one a breadcrumb, each one an echo of a boy who hadn't forgotten. "You were always the brave one," she whispered. "I just followed your lead." "Not always," Jamie said. "You were the one who kept believing when I stopped." Over the next few nights, they wrote less and talked more. They revisited the chapters they had already drafted, weaving in not just fantasy, but truth, about fear, about loss, about the resilience of young hearts. They added a chapter about a boy who disappeared and a girl who kept dreaming, about how stories can tether people across time and silence. One night, as they reread the passage about the magical tree that whispered memories, Eleanor paused. "You know," she said, "this isn't just a children's book." Jamie smiled. "No, it's us." They cried together that night, not from sadness, but from the kind of release that only comes when a wound is finally seen and salved. The next morning, their writing flowed like never before. Pages filled with ease, their dialogue crisp and true, their imaginations no longer burdened by what they hadn't said. They laughed again, truly laughed, like they had as children under sunlit skies. By the time they finished the final chapter, a quiet stillness settled over them, the kind that comes only when something unfinished is finally whole. They didn't need to say it out loud, but both of them felt it, that the book they'd written wasn't just a story. It was a letter. One that had taken 20 years to write. The morning their book was printed, Eleanor stood beside Jamie in the tiny Maribel print shop, her fingers trembling slightly as she held the first bound copy of Rooted Wings. The cover, illustrated with a tree whose branches turned into birds, was soft to the touch, matte-finished, and impossibly real. For so long, their story had existed in the margins of memory and notebooks, but now it had weight, texture, and a barcode. Jamie watched her as she turned the pages, eyes glistening. "We did it," he said quietly. "We really did." Eleanor nodded, unable to form words. Publishing hadn't been the goal when they began, but somewhere along the way, it became clear that this story wasn't just theirs anymore. Mr. Ellsworth had helped them connect with a local publisher who adored the manuscript and believed in its quiet magic. The initial print was small, just 50 copies, but it was enough. Enough to place on local shelves. Enough to read aloud. Enough to begin. On a Saturday afternoon, the Clement Street Library hosted a small launch event in the very reading room where Eleanor had rediscovered Jamie's name. Chairs were arranged in gentle rows, fairy lights strung around the windows, and a modest crowd, children, parents, curious locals, gathered to hear the story that had grown from a forgotten name in a borrowed book. Eleanor sat at the front, reading the first chapter aloud while Jamie turned the pages of the illustrated edition beside her, showing the pictures to the children. "Once, in a small town near the sea," she began, "two friends built a tree that could remember everything, even the moments they thought were lost forever." The room fell into a hush, broken only by the occasional gasp or giggle from the young listeners. When she finished, the applause was warm and real. Afterward, several children lined up to get their books signed, some shyly asking if the tree in the story was real. Jamie knelt beside one little girl and said, "Only if you believe hard enough." Mr. Ellsworth stood at the back, hands in his cardigan pockets, smiling like he knew this ending all along. When the crowd thinned, Eleanor walked to the children's section and carefully slid a copy of Rooted Wings into place, right next to the whispering tree, which had been the first breadcrumb. She stepped back and stared at it for a long time, heart swelling. "Looks good there," Jamie said, coming up beside her. "Think someone else will find it?" she asked. He shrugged with a grin. "That's how stories work. They find you when you need them." That evening, they returned to Maribel, stopping at the Ink and Bean Café, where their book was displayed proudly in the window. A sign below read, "New local authors. Ask about the tree." The barista handed them each a cupcake with a tiny paper tree on top, and they laughed over the sweetness of it all. Later that night, Eleanor took out her journal and wrote only one line, "We planted something today." And she knew it was true. Because some stories begin in childhood, and some begin when you decide to tell them. But the most powerful ones, like roots growing unseen, begin when you choose to share them. And somewhere in the world, maybe another girl would find their book, read the first line, and remember someone she once loved too. Months passed, and Rooted Wings quietly grew wings of its own, passed from hand to hand in quiet libraries, gifted to nieces and nephews, discovered on bookstore end caps with handwritten staff pics. Eleanor and Jamie never sought fame, only resonance, and what they received instead was something deeper. Letters from readers who saw themselves in the tree that remembered, children who doodled birds flying into stars, and teachers who read chapters aloud to classrooms filled with wide eyes and open hearts. With each response, Eleanor felt something in her spirit settle, like an old song finally reaching its chorus. She and Jamie were no longer just revisiting the past, they were planting new stories in the present. They began hosting workshops together. From memory to magic, they called it, teaching children and adults how to turn real life into fiction laced with hope. Eleanor found herself drawn to mentoring quiet kids who reminded her of her younger self, those who lived more in stories than in playgrounds, who kept secrets in their notebooks and dreams behind their glasses. Jamie, ever the animated storyteller, handled the drawing exercises, teaching kids how to sketch trees with roots that stretched into memory. Their lives became filled with laughter and travel. Day trips to coastal towns, pop-up readings at parks, even a podcast called Margins and Magic, where they shared how writing helped them reclaim their voices. The bond between them deepened, not just through memory, but through creation. One evening, during a workshop in a small town, a young girl approached Eleanor, clutching a dog-eared copy of Rooted Wings. "Is the tree real?" she asked. Eleanor knelt beside her, smiled, and said, "If you believe in someone long enough, even lost things can grow back." After the girl left, Jamie came over and slid a folded paper into Eleanor's hand. It was a mock-up for their next book, this one about the letters left behind in forgotten library books. "Another breadcrumb trail," she teased. He grinned. "Another beginning." And so they began again, writing by day, reminiscing by night, tracing the thin threads that connected stories and souls. Eleanor occasionally returned to the Clement Street Library just to walk the aisles, pausing by the children's section to see if the whispering tree still waited there, and it always did. One day, she found a sticky note tucked into the back cover that simply said, "I found my friend, too." Tears sprang to her eyes. The story was no longer just theirs. It had echoed, grown, taken root. The final pages of their second book were written in the shade of an actual tree, an oak outside a school where they were guest authors for the week. They sat side by side, their notebooks open, the sky above them painted with late afternoon gold. Eleanor looked over and said, "You know, I think this was always meant to happen." Jamie nodded, closing his notebook. "We just had to grow up enough to write it." And as the breeze rustled the pages and their laughter blended with the wind, it was clear, this wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning of many others. The call came on a quiet Tuesday morning, just as Eleanor was settling into her usual writing nook at the Maribel Café. Her mother's voice was tinged with regret as she explained that the old house, the one on Windmere Lane where Eleanor had grown up, was finally being sold and scheduled for demolition. The new owners planned to rebuild from the foundation up. "If you want to say goodbye," her mother said softly, "you should do it soon." Eleanor stared at her tea, the steam rising like faded echoes, and felt something shift in her chest. She hadn't visited that house in years, not since university, not since her parents split for good. And yet, every word of Rooted Wings, every dream she'd written with Jamie, had taken root in that backyard. That night, she told Jamie about the call. "We buried a time capsule there," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Remember?" Jamie's face softened. "Under the sycamore. You drew a treasure map, and I dictated the password, Star Fox." They both laughed quietly at the memory. By the weekend, they were on the road, driving 2 hours to the sleepy suburb they once called home. The house looked smaller than Eleanor remembered, the paint more faded, the yard overgrown and wild. But the sycamore still stood, tall and steady, as if it had been waiting for them. They approached it like pilgrims, shovels borrowed from the garage, guided only by memory and a crude map Jamie had redrawn on a napkin. It took an hour of digging before they struck metal, a rusted cookie tin, dented but intact. Eleanor wiped the dirt away with trembling fingers and opened it slowly. Inside were relics of a forgotten summer, plastic figurines, a Polaroid of them dressed as pirates, a friendship bracelet still vibrant with color. Beneath it all lay a small, dusty cassette tape labeled, "For U.S." Jamie's breath hitched. "We made a recording." Eleanor nodded. I think we wanted to remember how we sounded." They rushed to the car, where Eleanor found an old cassette adapter in the glove box. Jamie still drove a decade-old sedan, thank God, and slid the tape into the player. The speakers crackled, and then, laughter. Their laughter. High-pitched, fearless, alive. "This is Jamie and Eleanor," the younger Eleanor said brightly. "And if we ever forget how much we love stories, this is proof." Jamie's boyish voice chimed in. "We promise to never forget, even if we grow up, even if we move away." The silence that followed in the car was deep, weighted, holy. Eleanor's eyes brimmed with tears. "We really meant it." "Yeah," Jamie said, voice rough. "We really did." They sat there a long time, tape clicking softly at the end. Then Jamie reached over, took her hand, and said, "You know, part of me thought we were chasing ghosts. But this," he gestured to the tape, "this is real." That night, they didn't return to Maribel right away. Instead, they stayed in a small inn nearby, sharing stories under a sky washed in stars. In the morning, they returned to the house one last time. Eleanor took the photo from the capsule and slipped it into the mailbox, addressed simply, "To the future. May you find your own magic." As they pulled away, Jamie looked in the rearview mirror. "Think we should have reburied it?" Eleanor smiled. "No. I think it finally belongs above ground." And with that, they drove back toward the life they were building, leaving behind the house that had once raised them, and the memories that no longer needed to stay buried. In the weeks that followed their visit to Eleanor's childhood home, a subtle shift settled between her and Jamie. Not sharp, not immediate, but quiet, like the soft closing of a door neither had meant to shut. They still worked together on small projects, still shared late-night tea and laughter, but something unspoken lingered in the pauses, the kind of silence that doesn't ask to be filled, but unsettles when left too long. Jamie had grown more reserved, retreating into his sketches and solo walks, his once flowing words replaced by fragmented phrases. Eleanor noticed it in the way he deflected certain questions, the way he always seemed to be somewhere else even while sitting beside her. She didn't push. Not at first. But the space between them stretched like parchment left too long in the sun, fragile, dry, on the verge of tearing. One night, after a community reading event, Eleanor stayed behind to clean up alone. Jamie had left early, saying he was tired, and she'd smiled and nodded even as her chest tightened. As she stacked chairs and collected crayon drawings from the children's table, she found one that stopped her cold, a scribbled tree, its branches cut short, no leaves, just a single word written in shaky letters beneath it, "Gone." She tucked it into her bag without thinking, the metaphor too close for comfort. That evening, in her journal, she wrote not a story but a question. How do you stay when you're afraid of vanishing again? A few days later, Jamie texted her that he was going away for a while, to a cabin up north, for creative recharge. She wanted to reply with "Why now?" or "What are you running from?" but instead typed, "Let me know when you're back." No punctuation. He left the next morning. Eleanor felt the emptiness immediately, a strange ache like phantom pain from a limb still technically there. At first, she tried to drown the silence, reading, visiting friends, reorganizing bookshelves, but it followed her everywhere, even in the way the library lights hummed or how the wind rustled the pages of their book. And then, one evening, she returned home to find an envelope tucked into her mailbox. No stamp, no return address, just her name in familiar looping letters. Inside was a manuscript, about 50 pages thick, titled The Story After the Story. It was fiction, but she recognized the rhythm. The protagonist was a boy who'd been chasing memories too long, afraid the girl he found again would see that he hadn't grown in the ways she had. In it, he walked away, not because he didn't care, but because he cared so much, he feared messing it all up. The story ended with a boy standing at the edge of a frozen lake, wondering if love could survive winter. Eleanor cried for a long time after reading it, not because it was sad, but because it was honest. The next morning, she printed out her own story, this one only 5 pages long, a response. It was about a girl who had waited her whole life to be seen, and was now strong enough to say, "I still want to be seen, even if it means hurting first." She didn't send it. Not yet. Instead, she slid it into the back cover of Rooted Wings and placed the book by her window, letting the sunlight warm its spine. Some stories, she thought, need a little silence to grow between the pages. And when the time is right, the next chapter will write itself. Jamie returned in early spring, just as the cherry trees in Maribel began to bloom with cautious pink, like nature itself wasn't sure whether to open up just yet. Eleanor heard the knock on her door before she saw him, 3 short raps, then silence, as if waiting for her permission to be real again. When she opened it, he was standing there with a book under his arm, the same sheepish smile she'd once memorized as a child still lingering on his face. "I didn't know if I should come," he said, voice rough with travel and doubt. "But I missed the story." Eleanor stepped aside without a word, and he walked in like someone who wasn't sure if he belonged anymore. They didn't hug. Not yet. Instead, she handed him a cup of tea and sat across from him in the sunlit kitchen, where the light painted soft halos around them. For a while, they didn't talk, just sipped, breathed, remembered. Then Eleanor reached behind her and pulled out the thin 5-page story she had written. "I left this in the back of Rooted Wings," she said. "Just in case." Jamie unfolded it slowly, read it once, then again, his eyes never lifting until he was done. "I'm sorry," he said, finally. "I wasn't afraid of you. I was afraid of me." "I know," she replied. "But I'm not the girl you left. And you're not the boy who vanished." He exhaled, a sound full of relief and reckoning. "So what now?" Eleanor smiled. "Now, we write something new. Something that doesn't live in the past." Jamie nodded. "Not nostalgia. Not memory. Presence," she said. "Something from where we are, not where we were." They walked to the porch after that, the world outside alive with soft winds and the occasional chirp of returning birds. Jamie took out his notebook, and Eleanor brought hers. But for once, they didn't open them. They sat in the quiet, side by side, the warmth between them no longer fragile or borrowed from childhood. "Do you think people will care about another book from us?" Jamie asked. "Does it matter?" she replied. "This one's for us." He chuckled. "The unpublished masterpiece." "The book we haven't written yet," she said. "But we will." And in that moment, they understood. Their story wasn't defined by the books they'd published, the notes they'd exchanged, or the time they'd lost. It was defined by their willingness to begin again, again and again, even when they didn't have the ending. Especially when they didn't have the ending. That night, they finally opened their notebooks. The first line they wrote together wasn't poetic or profound. It simply said, "This time, we're writing forward." And that was enough. Thank you for diving into our incredible stories. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more adventures. This is just the beginning. There's so much more to come.